Any guesses? Sure, Prospect Lake School. And I was surprised, Prospect Lake Store. And I was surprised to learn from reading the Prospect Lake Reflections book that the store was built about 1912, and you'll know some of the people involved. But that was about the year that the road was started up the observatory hill, and during 13 and 14 and 15 and 16, we have shots of them pulling up the polar axis and the 10-ton, 6-ton mirror and getting the observatory built. Finished in 1916, telescope fully operational in 1918, but 1916 was sort of the year on the floor of the dome and tile. It's still there that when it was built. So there's a picture close to its early years, and somebody can probably identify that machine at the back. So that's a historical picture. Now it's called what? Tia's Heritage Cafe?
Changed hands and name, and I think they're going to call it the Heritage Bistro now.
Oh, I see. Good. Not Starbucks. Okay. This is, Ann Allen gave me this because I was telling her about swimming in Prospect Lake, and she said, well, here's a shot of a log that was eventually incorporated into a float in Prospect Lake. There it is. And it was a place where you could go down the chute and you could dive off. So we used to do that. So here's Prospect Lake. And from the hill, I always thought it looked like an eagle with its head on the right and the two wings and the tail on the left. And we went down on the road. I don't know if that was called Echo in those days, but there was a road on the right-hand side all the way down here. And we went down, this is too early a picture, but we went down and swam in Prospect Lake, and the family was called Baswick, I believe. Does that sound familiar? Yes. And Peter Salmon, who swam in the Olympics for Canada, he trained there. His sister was Enid. And before that, I believe, I may be corrected, that Marilyn Bell swam in the lake and trained for her across. And there was a woman by the name of Florence Chadwick? Okay. Now, back to Richard. I went to school in the daytime, but on the weekends and at home, I was in my own world. And the world consisted of remnants of the Second World War idea. So one of the workmen made me a wooden rifle, which is on my back. My father gave me his satchel from the First World War. He was a signalman in the 58th Battalion during the First World War. And around the other side, there's a big pack sack that you can't see that I was carrying. And I had my father's air raid warden helmet on. And if you look very closely, I mean, I could. I had a pair of gloves on. I mean, it's a bright summer day. And I had a pair of rubbers on, a pair of galoshes. And that was my outfit, you see, to go and conquer the world. And so I would ride this tricycle all over the place. The threat from the Japanese was such that the Royal Canadian Air Force enlisted a number of individuals in the area as spotters. Men and women who could take time in shifts and put on a pair of binoculars and track any plane that was up in the air. My mother was a spotter for the RCAF because we had help and she had time and la-di-da. And she wore a red blazer, which the hummingbirds loved, and she had a pair of binoculars, and she would spend her shift time, 4 hours, and we had in the breakfast room, we had a wall with all the silhouettes from Mitsubishis and Zeros and Henkels and Messerschmitts because of the Axis, you know, the German. So Japanese, and I learned all these profiles and things of this, kept looking and never saw anything, of course. But the men who were at Patricia Bay and Comox, they were training, and we had the Lancasters here in the Second World War, which were 2-engine bombers, And these guys knew her, Esther, and because she would phone all this stuff in, and they would buzz the hill and waggle the wings and hang out of the plane and wave at her. I thought it was just marvelous. There was an amphibian aircraft. You'll know this more than I think it was called a Catalina flying boat. And then it was a Tanso was a model of it. And they used to have some old rusty ones in Patricia Bay after the war, which I visited one time and crawled through the fence to review. So this little guy was keeping watch with his rifle for any Japanese aircraft. Yeah. We said, "Do you see any elephants?" No, you know. So here's the story, and oh yeah, I have a report card from Prospect Lake. That's in 1943. Normal progress. The teacher at the end of the year says, "But Richard tends to be a little too talkative at school," you know. So that was. The radio was a friend of mine, because on the radio there were programs for children in the 1940s. There was a program every weekday at 5:30 called Jack Armstrong, the All-American Boy, brought to you by Wheaties, Breakfast of Champions. And then followed Captain Midnight. But on Saturday morning there was a program called Let's Pretend. It was at 7:30 in the morning. I used to get up and listen to the radio. But on Sunday morning, something happened on the radio at CBC at 10 o'clock. 10 o'clock was the time, the official time signal from the Dominion Astrophysical Observatory. The beginning of the long dash marks 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, which was 10 o'clock, you see, our time here. So, you know, beep, 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 and then there was a 10-second pause, and then beep. What was the program that came right after that? Right after 10 o'clock, every Sunday morning, in the 40s, the BC Gardener. 15-minute program on the BC Gardener, which I wasn't interested at all, but at 10:15, Just Mary. Now, Mary Gannon worked for the CBC from the 30s on, and she told stories on the radio. Wonderful stories, and I listened all the time. And one of my book collections here is Just Mary's Stories. Oh, okay. Anybody else got that one? Yeah? Okay. Just Mary's Stories. And this is June the 11th, 1943 is inside, and here's the story. My father, who was responsible for many things, knew how much I was drawn to these stories. And so he said, "Why don't you write to Just Mary? Why don't you write about your story with your gun?" And so I did. And when she was visiting a cross-country tour for CBC, she was interviewed and she was asked what her most interesting experience that she had on her tour. And she said, "Seeing the moon through a fan letter." So I was the fan letter. So it said, "Young Richard Pearce, son of blah, 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 was the writer, and he explained how he was watching for Japs along the Pacific coast near his home with his wooden gun, because he knew that if the Japs ever landed, Just Mary would have to go off the air." Considering this was quite a compliment, she wrote a story about me, and she titled it, "Richard, Corporal of the Mounted Rifles." And she sent it to me, and then she came to Victoria, and she actually met my father, and came to the observatory, and brought me this book, and it says, "It's been nice to meet you, Richard, just married, June the 11th, 1943. And a little enclosure card to me. And this is book number 7 in my collection. So it's a little story, but it ties in with this little guy. Quickly. I had another friend, a dog called Willie Whitepaws. You can see the 4 white paws and the white chest. And he was a true friend. And there's another story to that, but he was a wonderful dog, and my first dog, and only dog. When visitors arrived at the Hill, I had to give off all the good stuff to them to wear, and I ended up with a Royal Canadian Air Force cap, a blue cap and a tiny wooden gun, not very appreciative at all, but I was a gentleman, so you gave all your good stuff to your friends, and we played what was called guns. Again, kids doing that. Because I was alone so much, my dad felt that reading would sort of be a good thing. So here's Richard reading some of his books. And I began to have a collection. And we still have 86 out of the 100 that I had. So here's Thunderhead, My Friend Flicka, and Huckleberry Finn, and Tom Sawyer, the A.A. Milne's House on Pooh Corner, and so on and so forth. The Just Merry book is there on the left-hand side. And there was a set of Indian stories, of which this is one. And I was a character in these stories, and so my father made a book plate for me. So there's the shelf that has got most of these now, and I really don't know where a couple went, but that's not a bad record for 100. So in every book, and here's this one. Okay, in every book there is this frontispiece, and my father made a bookmark that is just like that in every book, and there's a number. This is number 12. So here is the young brave on the right-hand side, Raven Wing, and his dog. And on the left-hand side is my father, Hawkeye. You notice the little hawk at the top left-hand corner? Okay. And my mother was called Bending Willow, which I thought was wonderful. It's right in the book here. Okay, and then the baby. Now, I've looked at this picture and I've read these stories again. And very interestingly enough, Hawkeye was killed quite early in Raven Wing's life. That wasn't the story my father told me. I don't know if he even read the books, but he read enough. And I think that picture on the left is Hawkeye and Bending Willow and me as a baby. And then this one on the right is Ravenwing growing up. So anyways, that formed part of the reason that my love of books was established and has persisted ever since. Although Wind in the Willows was written just after the turn of the century, and here is the facsimile of a first edition, but a first edition is worth about $700 now. This is a facsimile, but this is Wind in the Willows by Kenneth Grahame. You remember Wind in the Willows? Okay. And a man by the name of such and such has written Beyond the Willows, or The Wind in the Willows and Beyond. It's what happened after these people. And A.A. Milne's books, Winnie the Pooh and so on, came about 20 years later. And so these were all memorable copies. I went to Camp Elphinstone for 3 or 4 or 5 years. My father thought that when I wasn't in school I should be busy, so he shipped me off to Howe Sound by the Lady Rose. You remember the boat? And we all got there and went up there for a week or 2. Well, he sent me up there for a month. And so I sort of learned how to swim up there and had an interesting experience. So there I am walking down the street with my lunch and a book. After I left Prospect Lake, it was because my mother was not well. I must have been a handful, and I was put into St. Michael's School in Victoria. So I was still on the hill at night on the weekends, but every week I was a weekly boarder from Monday till Friday. And that was my uniform with the hat. But when you come home after school, you put on so I don't know, you lose, you go from one role to another, you know, and so on and so forth. So this was, my sister came home, my mother died in May in 45. Mother's Day, Sunday, was a, you know, I guess you want to remember it that way. And my sister had been brought home from a position she was at the North Carolina University to look after the family and or me and my dad, sort of. So she gave up her job for a while, came home, lived at the observatory, would take me swimming at Prospect Lake. I mean, after all, I was 11 here, and she was something about 28, or no, 11. She was 17 and 8, 25, and so she was wonderful. And she got a position at the University, Victoria College, which was at Craigdarroch Castle in those days. And she would drive the car in. My dad didn't use the car because he was at work all the time down the hill. She drove the car in and dropped me off at Royal Oak School. And I went to Royal Oak School for that particular year, 45, 40, 46. And she took me to Forbidden Plateau. Here's skiing. Imagine skiing in a Cowichan sweater, you know, completely inundated with snow. But I learned how to ski and still have, and it was a wonderful start to that career. So you're going to recognize this. This is Royal Oak School. And there's an exceptionally handsome guy, fourth from the left on the back row. That's Darrell. And who's on Darrell's right shoulder?
Peter.
That's Peter Goddard. And you'll have to help me out with the rest. This one, I don't know why, but is that Greeny Heel?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Then Enid right beside her.
Here's
Yeah.
Enid. So,
Yeah.
yeah, so this was 1946.
I think
Yeah, I see.
This was a good year for me. I was out of private school, you know, the St. Michael's, which was a strange environment because I wasn't of a private school background, and many English people that sent their children to St. Michael's were. We didn't live in Oak Bay. Not that there's anything wrong with Oak Bay, but we weren't of that culture. Yeah, watch it, okay. We weren't of that culture. And so I was happier here. The annex was functioning. We used to go tumbling in the annex in the bottom of these with these mats on. You know, we do the tumbling thing. And this was a good year. My sister was home, and it was fine. But at the end of that year, a year after my mother passed away, my sister had a beau that drove his car, Packard, with a rumble seat, up from Miami, where he was, and they got married in August at the Christ Church Cathedral in 1946. My father decided, because he was president of the Royal Society, that he would go to Europe and lecture, and Richard was placed in Shawnigan Lake School. Another transition. So I went to Shawnigan Lake School, a private school again. One of the best things about that is my father had given me a bugle when I was quite young, and I learned how to play the bugle. So of course I was nabbed by the assistant headmaster to play the bugle in the cadets for Shawnigan Lake. And I must say that it gave me a little bit of a what?
Edge?
Yeah. I mean, it was something no one else did, and I was pleased, and I tried to do it really well, and I joined the choir and all the rest of that stuff. So I was there for 2 years. But at the end of the second year, my father married Elizabeth Betty, the wonderful Alpine person that he met, and they established their house on the hill, I mean, where my home was. And I ran away from Shawnigan Lake School one Sunday afternoon. I mean, you can think about this subconsciously. You know, what was I doing? I was coming home. And I thumbed a ride. I had a friend, and he ran away too. We both got caned for this. The marks lasted for 3 weeks. In the dormitory, after it was all over, we had to stand up and take our drawers down. Everybody, the 6 boys in the ward, would see all these battle wounds, you know. And I thumbed down the Island Highway with John Hall. He was from Seattle. And we didn't have any money. So I begged for some coins on the causeway in front of the Empress Hotel where there are tourists, saying, I have 15 cents and I just need another dime to catch the bus home. And I kept doing that until I had enough money for 2 tickets to the observatory, plus enough for 1 grilled cheese sandwich at the coach line's bus depot. And that was a really good sandwich because we hadn't had anything to eat. So we did that and we came home. Well, we were in this playhouse that I showed you about before, and I guess we were making a bunch of noise, and my stepmother came out and terribly surprised. I mean, what am I doing here? And so we were going to run away, but we couldn't, and so we came back, and we were driven back to the school, and we got caned in the school. But 3 weeks later, my dad took me out of Shawnigan Lake and brought me home. So that's where I came to Royal Oak School again. There I am, but blowing up from the other shot. And, this is just a little introduction. You saw this before. These are, you know, astronomers and their wives. Well, if astronomers work at night, you wonder how in the world they had families, but they didn't seem to have a problem. There's a book on the counter that says it's something that's Sex Before Dawn or something like that. It's one of these new novels. So this was wonderful. But these were all twins and various people from the famous observatory astronomers who lived there. They had receptions, you see. It was a family, and everybody came on Sunday evenings or Sunday afternoons and had these gatherings. So here's the Cub Scout and in the uniform, and there's Peter's father. So there's the man that I remember as the Scoutmaster. And this is returning from the summer at Elphinstone. It looks like a Polish immigrant or something like this, you know, coming to Canada. I had so many different sort of changes in my life. I was sort of no fixed address. I learned how to swim really well. Not only at Camp Elphinstone, but at the Crystal Gardens. You can recognize the old Crystal Gardens? And there was a wonderful man there by the name of Mr. Butterworth, who was the lifeguard. And he really encouraged me. I learned how to dive off the high diving board and so on. So after Shawnigan Lake, I came to the school in May, and this was taken just a few days before, and I would have been in the picture next to Margaret Hurd there. On the left, I guess. But the only person that I wonder about is that Grant Sheldrake. Were you not in that year?
I missed the picture.
Yeah, because there's Danny Cuthbert on the right, and then who's that? The next, Barb Tubman, and then Enid, and then Gracie Chu. And then Bernice, maybe somebody?
Jackson.
Yeah. So, and who's the boy on the right with glasses? Beside Gladys Welch.
Eddie Lorenzo.
Oh, that's right. I thought he was wonderful. We had great chats. And then the rest. Jimmy Vi in the center at the top. Okay, well, you know all these. Now, probably the happiest of all my elementary years is this year. And this was 48, 49, I think. And you can see Danny here, Jimmy Vi, me, here's Grant, Lawrence, Shirley Goyette, Lorraine Looney.
Marjorie Mon.
Yes, who's this?
Marjorie Mon.
Marjorie Vaughn, right, and Margaret Hill. And this is Calla's younger sister, Kalasing, well, Draginder or
Uganda.
Uganda, yeah, and so on. And who was this?
Maryland.
Maryland?
I think.
Simmons.
Marilyn Simmons, okay. Thank you. What a wonderful group, you have all this memory. Okay, so that's grade 6, and there's Gladys. And then the Wheeler brothers at the top, Pat and Mike. They wore their Cub uniforms often. I sort of wondered whether or not there was, anything else, but they were proud of that, and that was really neat, and it was good. We had a good softball team, I remember that. Now, after school in that year, I usually took the bus home, or my sister, no, I took the bus home, or I walked. So about 3 weeks ago, Sylvia and I drove up West Sandage Road, and I photographed a couple places, and I'd like to tell you my connection with these, and you will certainly have something larger or more significant. This house, which is just a little bit south of where Markham Road cuts off, the man and lady in that day, 48, 49, they were very nice people. And the man was working outside, and I would stop and we'd chat. He says, "Come on in, and I'll show you something." So in his basement there was a pinball machine, and it was a baseball where the plate went around and the ball went and caught first base, second base, and you get a home run and so on. I thought I died and gone to heaven. You didn't have to pay, and all these things, you kept going. So I would stop in there almost every week. And he'd say, "Fine, fine." And then I'd be late for dinner, so on and so forth. So I stopped a couple of years ago, actually, and I met the man who was in that house, but he had a big operation of farm stuff going around. He didn't know who it was that was in 48.
You don't remember the name?
No, I don't, and I could go back.
Did they have horses?
Uh,
Teddy and Flo Hawks.
Maybe?
Yeah.
Think so?
Yeah.
Well, I'll write it down. Because Carolyn Duncan said to me, I just have to look up, this. Heather lived, and I didn't bring the copy of her house, which is gorgeous, she sent me. It's just a couple lots up at the corner of Markham and West Sandage Road, just across from where the Scout Hall was, before you go up the hill. Which incidentally, that hill was regraded back in 1915 to get the observatory's polar axis with horse and buggy up. They couldn't make it, so they cut off part of the top of the hill or regraded. It was all gravel in those days. Past St. Michael's of All Angels, on the right-hand side was a driveway. It was the driveway to the Singh farm. And Enid tells me you thought it was a dairy farm, did you?
Yes.
Yeah, I didn't know. I never went up the road. But that's where Calla would disappear, when we would be going home. He worked on that very, very right after school. Do you recognize that place?
Grandma's house. That was open the year I was born.
Was it? And what year do you think that was built?
41. It opened in 42.
42.
And they just celebrated, the guy that built it, they just celebrated his birthday a couple months ago.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, when I was on the hill from 40, I would observe Mr. and Mrs. Chu, that I do, from a distance,
My
grandparents. There was a wooden building set back off the property
Yeah.
where
The
they,
old barn.
there was, I think they lived in that before this house was built,
That's where my mother was born.
where your mom was born.
In that barn.
Yeah, because Gracie and Nancy came out from this rather modest dwelling, like they'd come out of a magazine. Absolutely crisp and, white. It was just one. And Gracie, I think, was 1 year after me, and Nancy, I think, was 1 year above. I think there's a couple years between the
That
sisters.
picture you showed earlier, that was Sue. That's Sue.
Ah. During these years, my folks, I went where they went, My father and then my sister were good friends of the Maltwoods. And as a 10-year-old boy, I used to go on a Sunday, and I would sit in the living room on a chair with my knees together and a small napkin over my knees and a plate with a teacup and saucer, and try to eat with all of that, you know, and keep everything, and shut your mouth sort of thing. So I was seen and not heard. Isn't that the expression?
Yes.
But I learned some things about the reverence and appreciation of literature and art. Although I didn't understand a lot of it, it was the attitude that my family had about these things. It was the same way when we went to Butchard's Gardens. My father knew the Butchards. And I remember being allowed to go up and look at the bowling alley in the Butchard property. Couldn't touch a ball. I mean, it was just to look. And her rose garden was a very important thing. So those were the kinds of things that we did that didn't put me in the community. It put me into various places along the community. And it was a different life. So there, lovely plum and cherry blossom in bloom. It was just 3 weeks ago when I think we took that picture. So then, leaving Royal Oak, just to finish off the slides, I went to Quadra Street School. And at Quadra Street School, here is Norm Smith, Heather's husband, and me. So there's Norm. And when I told Heather several years ago that I had gone to Quadra, she went home from one of the meetings and said to Norm, you know, da-da-da-da-da-da. And he said, well, there was a kid called Dickie Pearce that used to be at the observatory. You know, she still calls me Dickie. And so this was me, and this was Norm. Now, to tell the story, Norm colored his photograph with a red bow tie. And the reason he did that was that, boy, he was sweet on Lorraine Wright, who is right here, this doll. And she had red shoes on. He painted the shoes red, but it doesn't show up
You
there.
were supposed to tell that.
Oh, well, I'll phone him up and apologize. Because I was sweet. My first girlfriend was Marilyn Thomas, who is now Marilyn Thomas Cummings and is in Ontario. And Marilyn and I sat behind her in grade 7, and we got to be friendly, and my father invited her to the Hill one afternoon, and then we were able to go to the Crystal Gardens together and swim, and she's a good swimmer. And I will tell you, I haven't told this for a long time, but I was a good swimmer, so I dove off the side of the pool and came up. So she followed, but she chipped her incisor, 45-degree angle on 2-1, the dentist would call it here, and I just thought the world had ended, because I thought, how in the world is she going to live with a chipped tooth? So she went home, and Mr. Thomas, her father, he ran a garage very close to the roundabout where Douglas and Government come together. There was a BA station, I think, there, and Thomas, that's who he was. He wasn't home, but her mother was home, and her mother, I saw it really hurt that this had happened, but she was very fair about it, and it was okay, and so on and so forth. So that was sort of the love and tragedy of grade 7. I went on from bugle to playing tuba in S.J. Willis, and studied under Howard DeNike. And because my friend Dennis Tupman played clarinet, I switched over to play clarinet, and eventually we played in the festivals in Victoria. The boy on the far right is Kenny Walters, and believe it or not, he lives in Ladner, and when I'm in Tawasin, not far from there, he's taken several of the courses that I've been teaching for Elder College in the last 10 years. And he's 2 years younger than I am. And he didn't have his picture in his library, so he's absolutely delighted to be able to have that picture. I joined the Canadian Scottish Regiment in high school, played tuba for them, and then clarinet, and so on. And so this guy grew up, and so he left Royal Oak, left Prospect Lake, and lived at 1233 Union Avenue. And we moved in there in July 1951 after the year at S.J. Willis. So I was still on the hill through all of S.J. Willis. And I'm sure that you, just like me, you know, have collected your pictures. And there I'm at Mount View High School in grade 10 with Art Walker on the right, who's the president of the Alumni Association and has organized reunions and so on. There's a whole bunch of people there, and my time is up. So we'll go to one more. There's grade 11, and I can name you everybody in there. Ernest Livesey, a great chemistry teacher, and square dance teacher as well. And there's grade 12. Now, these people here are just one of two groups. Okay, Mount View High School had 2 classes of grade 12s. This was 1955, ladies and gentlemen, and this is 2005. 50 years later. And you had this gentleman come to speak here a few years ago, Ron Burnham.
Yeah.
Because he went to Strawberry Vale, I think. You remember that, Grant? So here's Ron Burnham, and Robin Knudsen, who is a veterinarian, international now doing project work, yours truly, and Gary Freer, and Jones, and Dave Phillips, who lives I think up in Port Alberni, and here's Art Walker, who kept this group going. Janine Graves at the time, Marlene Matthews, who's now of course changed the name. And this was Donna Finch, and her brother, Lance Finch, became a Supreme Court justice, lived on the island here. So it was great to see those people in 2005, and after 3 years at Mount View, that was the group of people, I guess, that I got to sort of hang out with. And so there's 11 years on the hill with this little guy. And I've made mistakes, and I'm sure I've left things out. I hope I thanked most of the people appropriately. There's a whole raft of stories I'd like to tell you, but it's 9 o'clock, and I have some respect for your bottoms sitting in your chairs there. So, ladies and gentlemen, thanks for the invitation to come and be with you. And
Thanks very much for coming.
uh,